All right. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jane Cherry, and I'm stuck here in the dark. We've got some load shedding happening in Johannesburg, so I do apologize for the bad picture. I'm from the Emancipatory Futures Studies program at WITS and also an activist in the Climate Justice Charter movement. And I'll be chairing today's seminar. Vishwas Sadka, the principal investigator of the EFS, has apologized. He will try and join us a little bit later, but he may not make it, so we'll see if he comes. I'm just going to start with a brief introduction to the program and the CJCM, Climate Justice Charter Movement, and then I'll introduce our speaker, Dr. Michela Marcatelli, and then she will speak for 30 minutes, and after that we will have some questions and comments. So today's event is hosted by the Emancipatory Futures Studies program at WITS. This is a new knowledge project which grapples with the climate challenge while trying to work out futures from a subaltern perspective to solve the climate problem. And the EFS knowledge research agenda is inter- and transdisciplinary, and it has various research thrusts like grand ecocentric futures, climate temporalities, decolonized futures, utopia and dystopia. It also looks at rethinking futures. And in this project at WITS, we've got some students working on various research projects ranging from water problems, the food systems, climate politics, ecofeminism, ecosocialism, and waste, to name a few. And essentially at the heart of the EFS project is the idea that the subaltern or the working class subject of history can think, act, anticipate, and imagine futures. So that's the EFS. The Climate Justice Charter Movement, or CJCM, is our second host of today's event. It's a movement built around the process of developing a People's Climate Justice Charter for South Africa. And it's made up of social justice and environmental activists and organizations, also including youth and children's movements and students, also faith-based organizations and food sovereignty organizations and labor. And one of the key sections in the People's Climate Justice Charter is a section where we outline systemic alternatives for transformative change. And in this section, we detail 14 people's alternatives to the current crisis. And these include democratic and deep just transition plans, socially owned and community-based renewable energy, democratizing the water commons. Those are just some examples. And during the course of 2022, we are profiling one of these alternatives every 2 months. And so our focus for February and March is water, hence this seminar on water. And we're also trying to develop a policy on water. And so we've already had a number of engagements with various resources to help us develop this policy. So that's the EFS and the CJCM. And just before I hand over to Dr. Marcatelli, I just want to also mention that another focus of the CJCM is to push back on fossil fuels. So I just want to highlight one of the petitions that we've put up, and I'll share it in the chat if everyone could just sign and share it, please. This is a call on all funders and investors to halt external funding for South Africa's just transition, including the 131 billion promised at the Glasgow COP summit, to halt all of this funding until South Africa agrees to stop investing in oil, coal, and gas. So I'll share the link shortly. Please sign and pass on. Okay, I think I've taken up enough time. I'm going to introduce our speaker and then hand over to her. So Dr. Michela Marcatelli is a research fellow in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology of Stellenbosch University and an adjunct lecturer in the Department of Political and Social Sciences of the University of Bologna in Italy. She holds a PhD in Development Studies from the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. She has researched extensively on the political ecology of water in South Africa, and more recently, she has been working on green extractivism in the semi-arid Karoo. Today, Dr. Marcatelli will be talking to us about her book, Naturalizing, Inequality, Water Race, and Biopolitics in South Africa. So welcome, Dr. Marcatelli. It's great to have you with us. You have 30 minutes, so until about 4:45, and after that, we will take comments and questions. Right, over to you.
Right. Thank you. And I think I will share my screen if that's all right, because I've prepared a few slides, which are basically pictures that I will use during my talk.
Yes, perfect.
And okay, so let me just do that as I start. But first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak here at this event in this situation. It's really a pleasure because I'm calling from Italy at the moment. And it's just nice to be back in South Africa. So thank you again. And sorry also again for the delay. Can you see my screen now? Is that all right?
Yes, I can see.
Perfect. So I'll just put full screen. And before I start, as you said, I'm going to talk to you about this book, which is based on my PhD. And I do hope that some of these reflections and ideas that I'm going to share with you might be relevant, especially for your work on water policy and on reforming water policies in South Africa. So I'm going to read a few pages as I present, but stop here and there to also maybe contextualize the book a bit more in relation to the work that you've been doing. Can you see my first slide, right? You can see it. I'm not sure it's full screen, but you should see, right, okay, now it's better. You should be able to see the cover of the book, which is, as you said, Naturalizing Inequality, and also the table of contents. So basically, the way I describe it is really a book on the crisis of inequality in contemporary South Africa, which I see and talk about through one of its most striking manifestations, which is access to water. So it's very much a book about a water crisis, as I will say in a moment, but also water justice within South Africa. And I think it is important to start this talk by situating water access in its historical context, especially that of the post-apartheid years, to signal the many continuities between 1995, when the pamphlet on the left-hand side of the screen was published, and 2021, when the picture on the right-hand side was taken. And just to give you just a little bit more of information, what you see on the left-hand side is a pamphlet about the new Bill of Rights in the new Constitution of South Africa, which appeared, I think, in around 1995, as I said, in the Mail and Guardian, and really meant to popularize this idea that everyone in the country was going to have access to water as a new socioeconomic right. And I hope you can read what it's written in there, because it's really interesting. So, as I was saying, water access, I think, continues to be an unresolved issue in the country. We might actually say, and I think you do phrase it in your work, it is a crisis in itself, the water crisis. But how do we qualify these crises? And what is really important for me in this book especially, it is the fact that access is still structurally unequal and racialized. And this translates into a great many ordinary water crises, which are similar yet different from day zero in Cape Town. And these ordinary water crises are affecting especially smaller rural towns, which we can often, of course, define or characterize as water-stressed communities. But this is where I want also to stop for a second and just to, suppose a bit of a disclaimer, and just to point out that in my narrative, in my narration of the water crisis, I don't really put the climate crisis to the fore. It's not the central issue which I analyze in this book. And I'll go back to why that is the case. I've no doubts that the climate crisis is already actually exacerbating existing inequalities, but the latter are really what are the focus of this book, what interests me, what I'm concerned about in this book. So as I go on, as I proceed in this presentation, you might notice that, but I just wanted to clarify from the beginning why the climate crisis is not really at the center. So the water crisis, which I'm trying to narrate, to explain, to go through in the book, is also clearly a matter of broken promises on the part of the ANC. And not only for reasons of incompetence, I believe, but rather for the water politics that the governing party has decided to pursue over the years, which of course translates into water policies. Hence also my comment at the very beginning to stress that I believe it's very important, in fact, to address these water policies and try to effect change also at that level. And in fact, water poverty and poor water service delivery regularly re-emerge as topical issues at each election, which is what the two pictures actually refer to. So the one in the middle was taken in the village of Kraipan in the northwest, just before the national elections of 2019, and it was published in the Mail and Guardian. And the right one was taken in Pungulungweni in the Eastern Cape before the local elections last November, and that appear in the Daily Maverick. And I would like you to focus just for a second on the bucket as a material symbol of the continuity I was talking about earlier. But for me, the water crisis also reveals a fundamental paradox of the post-apartheid period, really. The fact that inequality has persisted, if not actually increased, despite a water reform which is explicitly committed to reducing inequality. And let me just, again, stop here for a second, just to stress once again that there is a water reform in the country, which has been going on since 1998, which is goes parallel to land reform. But it's my impression, and I don't know, maybe you can prove me wrong later in the discussion, but that not so many people are aware of that. But I actually think there is even more to that. The paradox has to do not only with the reproduction of inequality, but also with its legitimization, naturalization even, which is of course the title of the book. In one sense, and I know this is a provocation, but many, maybe some of us, might look at these pictures on the screen and find them normal. This is just the way things are still in South Africa, even if we are in 2022. So having said that, how do I understand these inequality paradox in the book? I consider water governance in relation to three broader issues that go beyond water, right? Neoliberalism, race, and the environment. And I look at how these relations play out in one particular context, the waterbed plateau of Limpopo province, and this is a map. Now, the waterbed is really an interesting place for me, and I'm still thinking about it a bit more theoretically, how to make sense of a place like that. Because on the one hand, it's definitely a marginal rural place. Actually, I don't know how many of you were able to locate it, to put it on a map before I just showed you one. And this marginality has actually some relevance also in relation to issues of race, and we might go back to that later. But in fact, the waterbed is also, on the other hand, quite central to the political economy of the country, and in particular to its minerals energy complex, the MEC, because this is the district where Medupi power station is actually located. So as I proceed, let me just say a few things about these three relations, starting with water and neoliberalism. Oh, no, sorry, I have another slide of the right, yes. I just wanted to make another little comment about the climate crisis in the waterbed. The reason why I don't really engage with that in much depth has also to do with what I was able to observe empirically in the field when I was there during my PhD, as we said, between 2013 and 2014. And that was just before the drought hit the country, right? So there was certainly, of course, a sense of like water scarcity emerging quite clearly, but it was just before the drought. And actually, when I was there in the waterbed, we were badly hit by floods. So these is just a couple of pictures to show you what happened when I was there. Little streams that all of a sudden became these very powerful rivers, and actually roads that were washed out, and meaning I was also stuck on a farm for quite some time, because the provincial road linking Modimolle to Lepalale was, as you see on this picture on the screen. So that's another element, but of course, another clear sign that the climate crisis doesn't, in relation to water, is not just about the drought, but it's also the situation of extreme weather phenomena and flooding in this case. So now, going back to the first relation, that between water and neoliberalism. This is, of course, something that has received a lot of attention in the literature, especially in relation to water services or access to drinking water and its commodification. In the book, however, I also speak of a neoliberal biopolitics of water to explain why water resources are preferentially allocated to production vis-à-vis biological and social reproduction. And this is because production, and hence economic growth, are considered the best way to enhance life and reduce inequality. In other words, instead of directly improving water access for poor people by providing more individual taps, for instance, which is what most of them want and keep asking for, water allocation must contribute to further economic growth and job creation, so that people can have more income at their disposal to spend on things that are necessary to sustain life, such as, indeed, water. As a result, those groups that use water productively, such as commercial farmers, for instance, but also mining and energy companies, tend to benefit from much more secure water access. The state also makes water available to them, as I show in the book in regard to Medupi Power Station. And importantly, they tend to be shielded from redistribution as part of the water reform I was referring to before. Even in cases of extreme inequality in the distribution of water, like in the waterbed. But let me just also make this argument a bit broader and say that this extreme inequality in water access is really very visible in rural spaces across the country, especially in what was usually white rural South Africa, right? So outside the Bantustans. And again, let me stop here for a second to add an important piece of information, which I think is also relevant for the broader discussion in relation to the Climate Justice Charter about the commoning of water resources. Now, as I said, I'm focusing very much on water resources here as opposed to water services, although of course I do look at the interactions between the two. And I just wanted to add that the reason why some groups in South Africa, like indeed commercial farmers and white commercial farmers, I should probably say, have access to more water than other populations groups, and this access is very much secure, has to do with the water reform again, and especially with the notion of existing lawful uses, which is basically a translation of the property clause, the constitutional property clause, into the realm, the domain of water. And actually, this very notion, which is a very important legal and policy tool, makes the legal status of water very ambiguous in South Africa. At least this is my argument. Because on the one hand, if we take the National Water Act of 1998, which is considered very modern, new progressive water legislation, and we look at the preamble of it, and I'm just going to read it very quickly, it states that water is a natural resource that belongs to all people, okay? So here we have a sense that water in South Africa is indeed a common or a public good. There's a bit of ambiguity also there in what we mean by what is the difference between those two notions. But then it is also regarded as a private property when we take into account existing lawful uses. So white commercial farmers, for instance, are very certain that water is something that they do own and that they can dispose of in any way they see fit. And that right, that private property right, rests first and foremost on the ownership of the land. So it is a sort of a land-water nexus, as I call it in the book and also elsewhere. But it's very, again, for that sense of how do we proceed in the commoning of water resources and how do we reform water policies in a progressive, of course, way, in a transformative way that brings, that tries to realize, to achieve water justice. I think that's a very important piece of information, element of the story that we need to take into account and we need to address especially. And of course, we can talk more about that later in the discussion. But having said that, right, and that was the first relation again was between water and neoliberalism and the centrality, the primacy of economic growth in that regard. It is not really all about growth. And that serves me to introduce the second relation, which is water and race. So looking at the water lake through the lens of water also illuminates a particular politics of place enacted by most of its white residents, reproducing the plateau as a white space, something that inevitably echoes the Group Areas Act and the policy of forced removals under apartheid, which took place, had very concrete material effects also in this part of the country. This politics of place is based on white people's exclusive control of land water, right? That nexus that I just mentioned, and is carried out on both a material and a discursive level. On the one hand, white landowners have been evicting more and more Black people from their farms, thus prompting a process of urbanization in the small towns of the region, and especially in Falvata, which lies in the middle of the plateau, and which is the town where I conducted most of my fieldwork. And here is just, here are a few pictures of the town. Now, this process of urbanization, in turn, has increased the demand for water services, which, however, cannot be met because white landowners control all local water resources. Again, because of that legal notion, legal tool, which is the existing lawful uses. As a result, water shortages in Falvata have become the norm, the ordinary water crisis to which I alluded before, making living conditions more difficult, if not harsh, of course, especially for Black township residents. Now, on the other hand, white landowners who have access to all the water they might need, right? They don't suffer from any water shortages, are adamant that they're not responsible for the water crisis in the town. In fact, and this is a crucial point, they claim that the space of the white farm and that of the now Black town are fundamentally distinct, even though what a water perspective does is precisely to show the connections among them. For instance, if we ask ourselves, where is the water, the drinking water in a place like Falvata coming from? Well, it comes from the river, the Makola River, which is contained within white farms and controlled, indeed managed on an everyday basis by white farmers. Now, in the book, I use David Hughes' idea of other disregarding to explain how whiteness as a symbol and structure of power is enacted by most, if not all, white local landowners through keeping and even strengthening their private control over water, and being fundamentally opposed to the very idea of sharing, while at the same time ignoring the water-related problems experienced by Black local people. And I just wanted to give you a very clear illustration of what I mean by these. I think I just left the film maybe, or was coming back, like visiting again after the longer stretch of fieldwork. And I I discovered that the local nature conservancy, which is an important actor in my story and also an important gatekeeper for my research, had organized a debate, right, about a debate about water, indeed framed as a water crisis, water scarcity, and things like that. And they had invited a few guest speakers, also from the Department of Water and Sanitation, and this meeting was held in the town, in Farvate. And now, looking at the program afterwards, I realized that none of the speakers and nobody in the audience actually talked about. So the meeting was not at all also about the water problems in the town. So it's just to give you a sense of like to what extent, right, these water-related issues, which are really especially physically concentrated in the Black Township, can be ignored by other residents, in this case, white residents and white landowners. So it's almost as if they were never there in the first place. But again, as I said a few times already, there is more, right? And I do also use Jennifer Wenzel's notion of unimagining to argue that Black people on the plateau are largely rendered unimaginable in this way or through this narrative. What are they doing here? The narrative indeed would go, now that their labor on the farms has become superfluous. And why should they be entitled to receive more water if they're not working for it anymore? Now, there is also another important way in which Black people are unimagined on the plateau, and that has to do with the third dimension, or the third relation, that between water and the environment, which actually I need to qualify as environmentalism, and even better, white environmentalism, and also private nature conservation, which is a major land use change on the plateau that has been going on for many years now, since the 1980s, but it has definitely accelerated in the past few years. So white landowners turned conservationists are producing, again, both materially and discursively, the waterbed as a spectacular wilderness, thus reproducing a colonial imagery of unpeopled veldt. Now, from this perspective, the very presence of Black urban poor people becomes contested because it does not fit the representation of the landscape conservationists have in mind and try to sell through the local ecotourism industry, something that you can get a sense of and see in these pictures. And going back to water, the water demands of, again, the Black urban poor, all of a sudden become unsustainable. Now, this is really where discourses about water scarcity, right? And so a particular reading of the water crisis and the climate crisis, which is completely disconnected from discourses and issues of justice, become very instrumental in perpetuating the status quo, in legitimizing unequal power relations as they manifest also in access to natural resources. There isn't enough water for all because water is becoming scarce, and therefore we cannot really meet your expectations and your demands for more, better quality water services. So there's this interesting interplay, I find, between what is sustainable and what is unsustainable. And I just want to make a final point, and I think I'm right on time, on sustainability indeed, before concluding, actually without a real conclusion, because this is just the beginning of our conversation, I hope. Now, private nature conservation, right? Nature conservation in general, but in this instance, let me say private nature conservation, is usually hailed for its sustainable use of water resources, especially in relation to, or better, in opposition to irrigation farming, which, for instance, in the Waterberg is still a very important economic activity. The place is renowned for tobacco farming. Now, in the book, however, I question these assumptions by showing that private game farms and nature reserves in the Waterberg tend to use water in great quantity, while at the same time evading state regulations on water use. I call it also a sort of black box, really, of water use in the conservation sector. And it has two meanings, I argue, but let me just say that for now. It's really like, yeah, it is a black box, let me put it that way. But again, more importantly, the alleged sustainability of these industry, of these green economic activities, and therefore their contribution to a greener growth, are founded, again, on the unequal distribution of resources, something which they completely fail to recognize, to acknowledge, and therefore let alone to rectify. And I think I will stop there, if that's all right.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Marcatelli, for that excellent presentation, and yeah, just for sharing your research and your book with us. We are going to now take any questions or comments. So if anyone has a question, you're welcome to raise your hand. You're also welcome to write in the chat, and we will take a few questions at a time. So I can see in the chat we have Patrick. Others, feel free to raise your hand or write comments in the chat so long while we take Patrick's question. Patrick, you just need to unmute yourself.
Oh, congratulations, Michela. It's wonderful that this has come anyway to a PhD, but to a wonderful book from the Arizona Press. So that's just terrific to find comradely work published in the North, and that you're also grounded in one of the universities here. So thanks so much, and bringing Foucault back into our awareness. So I wanted to ask about the next site up from Waterberg, where the most intense war is occurring over water between some of those same types of white landowners, conservationists, even Saudi Arabia's Mr. Bonesaw, MBS Mohammed bin Salman. And that's the Mikado area, Messina Mikado Special Economic Zone, which if it goes through, and last week there was an approval from the LEDIT, the Limpopo Economic Development and Tourism Authority. So it does look like it's kind of moving along through its environmental impact assessment. They don't have a coal-fired power plant, and therefore water isn't needed for cooling, but it will be used for this massive industrial complex. I'm just wondering what lessons we have, because it seems like, unlike the Waterberg, unless you want to tell us more about social resistance and community struggles, certainly Lapalales had great struggles against abuse of water at Medupi and with the Hydrological mine and all of those. There's going to be a crocodile river augmentation scheme from the Val, and lots of crazy things to amplify this MEC power to take water for abuse in coal-fired power plants, or even washing coal and sending it out as an export. But really the hottest struggle is Messina Mikado, especially because of this new EIA and the seeming environmentalist victory, as even Leknanolo Masoko, the head of this LEDIT, and the MMSEZ admitted last week that they're pulling back the coal-fired power plant because of environmentalists. And there the race question is profound. So I'm wondering if you're thinking about that. Low-income African community groups in Limpopo, in the Save Our Limpopo Valley coalition, right? And the likes of Mohammed bin Salman with this huge big game farm that can land a 747 right next to Mikado, which is, by the way, the new name of the old Dorpy called Louis Tricard. So I'm just wondering, what do we learn for that kind of struggle from one part of Limpopo on the west side for the other comrades who are fighting and trying to figure out alliances on the north side?
Thank you, Patrick. Michela, I'm not sure if you want to answer that question before we go on to Vish's question, or are you happy to take another question?
I can, yeah, sure. I can take another one.
Okay, let's take
you
another
decide.
one.
The chair decides.
Vish, go for it.
Yeah, just firstly, a big apology, Michaela, that I couldn't be here at the start of your presentation. I'm just going to switch my video off because of reception. I had a commitment. I had to meet one of our deputy vice chancellors now. Well, we made sure it's climate, sustainability, and what is it, inequality. Yeah, so our university is trying to develop a response to the climate crisis, and it was an important engagement. But anyway, I think Jane's been able to handle our platform. Again, I apologize for missing the complexity and nuance of your perspective and so on. And I'm really looking forward to reading your book. But we've also created this platform as part of our campaigning sort of work, also in the climate justice charter movement. And where we have a statement in the charter on, democratizing the water commons. Now, so this is not a space for sort of technocratic reason and planning in that sense, sort of top-down thinking, but we do need to fix these problems. And we do need to, maybe it comes down to, is it about public goods? Is it about reimagining the commons? Is it about sort of new commons governance frameworks, etc.? So I'd really like to get a feel from you about what does this mean for policy? Because we do want to shift the debates in South Africa about fixing the multifaceted water crisis. So yeah, just from where you're sitting. So again, I know it's a big ask, and these are complex issues, lots of nuance, I'm sure. But just your thoughts. If we campaign on this platform, we do need more substantive answers to the systemic crises around water. Thanks.
Thank you, Vish. And then just to note, there's 2 comments in the chat. Thank you very much. Very informative and interesting from Lungisa. And then Popsy Pillay says, I'm definitely going to dig into this book. And then, yeah, Vish says, how do we fix these problems? What does this mean for policy? So over to you, Michela, to answer those 2 questions.
Thank you. All right. So, well, thank you, first of all. Patrick, thank you for your question. I'm afraid, I'm not really engaging much with, well, not at all, I suppose, from where I shifted the focus of my attention to the Karoo. So it's been, Limpopo is not really, I haven't really followed that much, and sorry about that. But I suppose I would be a bit, not really optimistic in terms of lessons learned, and especially in terms of struggles, because first of all, Lephalale, yes, it's a bit different because Medupi is right there, but the center, the plateau itself, has not really shown much in terms of struggles. That there was actually, when I was there, I was actually surprised that there was definitely a lack also of service delivery protest, just to mention something which is typically related to water issues in South Africa. So yeah, I'm not really optimistic. I do feel like the Medupi case in particular has shown us that first, state, for some things, there's a lot of state capacity, and I mean, in the sense of like they can do things, but there's no second thought in terms of like just leaving the poor out of the question and not including them at all. Literally, as I explain in the book, if we look at the plans, the documents for these water transfers, so to transfer water from Gauteng really to Medupi, the waterway plateau disappears from the map. It's not even taken into account, even though it's a single river basin. So yeah, so I don't know. I'm sorry, it's half of an answer, but I'm not really sure that we have learned lessons, especially in terms of struggles, and to counter those movements that we see also up there, even north and in Limpopo. And going to Vish's question, I get your point absolutely. So I don't know if you were were there when I was mentioning existing local uses, right? So I think a very concrete starting point, I think, would be from a policy perspective, would really be to engage with this notion of existing local uses and actually try to reform that, to dismantle that. It's very interesting for me that the way it is phrased also in the National Water Act and the way it has been treated over the years, it's still very unclear whether or not this is a transitional category. So is the protection of existing water rights something that was supposed to happen in the first year of democracy, or especially between 1998 and the first 2000, something like that? Something else wasn't supposed to happen in terms of water licensing, etc. That didn't. And I mean, if you ask, it's very, in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that we need to address this issue of private property rights in water. And I think that could be done at the level of course, there is all issues about the land and the constitution and reforming that. But these, I think, is different. But it's definitely, for me, would be the first concrete step to engage in with water policies, right? And the issue of ELUs and the issue of redistribution, how to do that, basically, just to start redistributing water, which hasn't really happened. I mean, much less than what happened with land. And these, I think, is really in terms of, and we need to, indeed, as you were saying, try to take concrete steps in terms of democratizing the water commons. But first, really engaging with the legal status of water and try to reform that part of the water legislation. Yeah, let me stop there. I'm not sure I was concrete enough, but yeah, otherwise let me know.
Thank you. No, Vish says thank you. I don't see any other comments or questions at the moment. Does anyone? Okay, Patrick, go for it again.
That dreaded silence. Okay, so let me try and fill it. I think the point you just made, Michela, is so exciting because it implies that something done, you might remember the 1998 Water Act, was meant to change riparian rights, right? Those fat and sassy white landowners who use water extremely irresponsibly. They, irrigate between noon and 3 p.m. kind of thing, and half the water goes up in evaporation. That was meant to end and be replaced by an administrative system. I happened to work for Kader Asmal at the time, the water minister, and he was sort of, saying we're going to do this legislative change away from riparian to administered water rights, to remove property rights in the land-water nexus. But I think you're implying it was just tokenism, or it was a fake, a talk left, walk right, which he was really good at. And I just think that's very important for us, because sometimes the big theoretical dilemma, feminists know it, anti-racists know it, for example, fighting apartheid, to say we need the market logic to replace the racist logic. Feminists who do what's called lean in, right, would say, look, market relations, you can stop being so damn patriarchal because it'll be in your benefit to have some women on the board. Lean in feminism. And there's lots of that logic. In our field, we call this ecological modernization, as a sort of theory of using markets and technology to solve ecological problems. And you're saying, and I don't have any reason to disagree, that those legal reforms are bullshit. They just were tokenistic, or Kader Asmal was just playing. So expand on that. I mean, that would be great, because allegedly what you are asking for, reforms in water law, actually happened. And the white farmers were allegedly disempowered by removing their riparian rights. But like so many things that happened after 1994, a constitution that gives you rights to water, and then Johannesburg Water starts cutting people off, putting on prepayment meters, and you try to fight in the constitutional court, and you find you don't actually have any substantive water rights. So I'd love you to expand on that, and whether we kind of spin our wheels. And I'm kind of asking my dear friends like Jane and Vishwas, are you also spinning wheels by going to Parliament and asking for changes that are kind of within the realm of minor reforms to existing systems, which, as I say, when you try to bring in ecological modernization and overlap it on apartheid and patriarchal land, the structural underlying capitalist, racist, gender, and ecological, destructive relationships are so strong. So hoping for some, parliamentary, statement against, for a climate emergency or for, kind of water rights might be, contributing to that tokenism. Anyway, I'm just trying to be provocative. I hope that's okay.
Thank you, Patrick. Go for it, Michela.
Right. So yes, of course, you talk about tokenism. Yes, maybe, but for me, what really the point remains, and I remember having this conversation also at some point with Jackie Juggett, which is we've been concentrating so much on the Water Services Act, right, especially in relation to the privatizations of water services in the early 2000s, etc. But we sort of forgot about the National Water Act, which was really considered this very important progressive piece of legislation. But my point is that the National Water Act is funded on this fundamental contradiction, which is, on the one hand, in the very first page or whatever, the preamble, you say, well, water is a resource that belongs to all people, but then you introduce also in the midst of it this notion of existing lawful uses, which is really a hybrid sort of property right in water, which of course goes absolutely against the very objectives of the Act, which are sustainability and equity in water access. And you do that again, technically by subsuming that difference between what used to be before in the previous water regime of riparian water rights between private water and public water. Everything is now private water if you ask like a white farmer, or right. So that reform, it seems to me, it has started, but it has not been complete. So yeah, maybe it is tokenism in the sense of what you were saying, but really that fundamental point, the key point for me is really to re-engage with the National Water Act and to try to point to those contradictions, to those fundamental tensions, and again to revisit and reform, possibly change, actually remove that notion of existing lawful uses. And maybe just to give you a further example, which is really ammunition, I suppose, in these sort of conversations, but I was really struck at some point, and I don't remember what, I probably do mention it in the book, during a conversation at the Department of Water and Sanitation, there was this mention of redistribute, right? This the right to use it or lose it, right? That we are familiar with, maybe in other contexts, in other situations. But when it comes to water and to existing lawful uses, the way it was, the reaction I got from the Department of Water and Sanitation was like, well, we cannot do water grabbing, right? In relation to those who supposedly don't hold water rights anymore, but in fact they do. It's like what the law says and what in practice happens. They do hold water rights. They definitely feel like they are holding water rights as in the previous regime. Nothing has really changed. So that also that feeling like water grabbing as something that might happen to those who use most of water resources and who benefit still from an equal system of water allocation. I think that was really telling, was revealing.
Thank you, Michela. So we have some comments in the chat here. Ferial, just responding to Patrick, says, what would you then suggest people do? And then Patrick says, I think the Sowetans taught us after they lost Mazibuko burst Joburg water, break the meter, enjoy the water, or even more suave, turn the meter into a statue with informal plumbers linking pipes away from prying state eyes. And then Patrick says, so the question for activists is always, do we legitimize the source of tokenism, Parliament on climate, the National Water Act on water access, or delegitimize through direct action? And then a few more comments from Patrick. Commenting of water through meter sabotage, as in Soweto, is beyond the rights talk strategy, not so. Or finally, since the Parliament has ignored the Climate Justice Charter, do something very radical, promote climate finance sanctions against Andre de Ruyter. Go for it. Ferry, I'm not sure if you want to say more. Yes, okay. Ferry, you may go for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Marcatelli. I think that was a really great presentation. I enjoyed it very much. I just want to add, I think that, you know, Patrick, I think that I hear you when you say, do we do these things and then legitimize these kind of neoliberal governments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that it's misunderstanding what building a movement is all about. And it's misunderstanding the types of struggle and activism that we've been involved in. So I don't think that, and I think it's different avenues. You can't have one avenue. It doesn't succeed. And we've seen that. Direct action is wonderful, but I think that what it does get is media and often nothing else. Or it's as slow as other avenues of fighting. So I think that you have to have different arms when you're building a movement and when you're fighting an issue. So it's not just one thing. I think that also the other thing we must be honest about is that and you've just, you know, you've alluded to that quite well in the presentation, is that our water resources is in a state of disaster. And it's not just about people breaking the meter and enjoying the water as we did 10, 15 years ago. Now we're dealing with other issues, is that the water is not clean enough for us to drink. So how do we deal with those issues? And I don't think, I don't think that it's one avenue. And one thing that we've been doing as COPAC, which I think is really important, is that we've been building citizen science, activist citizen science on the ground to build awareness on how do we take back the commons. And that is people are doing it on the ground. So we're doing that. People are like taking back the commons. People are then also challenging policy. People are also challenging, and we want to go to parliament, not because it legitimizes. We're going to parliament because we need to show that that's where a lot of the issues lie. And if we don't democratize our water resources, we are going to be in big shit. And I mean that figuratively and literally. Thanks.
Thank you, Ferial. And I see there's a comment here from Patrick again. Good rebuttal. You're right that the water sanitation service delivery protests are not really effective so far. We definitely need a national movement of water warriors, especially in the current austerity regime in which municipalities are really out of money. Check the situation in Ugu, for instance. Michela, I'm not sure if you have any responses or comments about that.
Just one thought that came to my mind, as of course, Farah, you were right to mention also the issue of water quality, right? But just to maybe to add, and sorry, maybe this is not really practical, but it's just to add a layer of complexity actually, which needs to be taken into account in any case, and which is this: the water big. Just to go back to this context, which I know, paradoxically has a very, not paradoxically, but it has a very good water quality, right? Good standard of water quality. And paradoxically, that's what it is paradoxical, is that has an impact, a direct impact also on the value of the land. So I was told. So there is this, again, interconnections between the water and land, and also reproducing these inequality of access to both resources, because then who can afford also to buy that land, but the water is so good in a context, in a general situation of very bad quality water. So just to add in passing, just that note.
Thanks, Michela. Ferial, is that an old hand?
And then there is a question about groundwater I see in the chat.
Yes, so Patrick has asked another question. Could you tell us more about new work, since water destructive fracking has been a big problem in the Karoo and generated lots of resistance, but also with regrettable race class features? And then from Alexandra, do you think there's a potential to tap into groundwater for poor people in Limpopo?
Yeah,
fracking. Yeah, go for it.
I'll take the one on groundwater. On fracking, I haven't really. I've sort of, I'm not really looking at water in the Karoo. Of course, it's an important issue and it's always there. So I wouldn't be able to comment that much on that, and especially on new things happening on the ground, right? But on groundwater, that's a very interesting question. But it's also, again, there is that, I suppose that problem of technical solutions as opposed to looking at water from a political perspective. And that has to do with the fact that, sure, there is groundwater, right? And it is being used. But the problem is we don't really know, the state doesn't really know how much water has been used especially by private landowners, because there is no registration of those water users, of groundwater users. Although it's, again, complicated in terms of the law, what they are supposed to do and what they are doing in fact. But in any case, the point is we don't really have that much information. On the other hand, when we look at what the consultancy firms have been suggesting, proposing to the development of water and sanitation, also in terms of how to solve these problems in water-stressed communities, which is go and look at, explore, expand your ground to use. But one needs to to remember that, again, these groundwater is privatized, like surface water. So it's not automatic for a community, especially, again, in places like, again, the former white rural South Africa, to access those resources. It's not like because we are in a rural space that the water is just there for everyone to use and to take. It's of course, a very privatized, securitized, fenced, hyper-fenced sort of space. So I think it's a very good and relevant question, but yeah, we need to do it to know more about that.
All right, thank you. I'm going to allow for any last hands or questions. Okay, I see Vish, go for it.
Yeah, Michela, one of the things we've been finding in our activism and even research work is what I increasingly call governance droughts in South Africa. So not your typical meteorological or farming droughts and so on, but driven by state failure. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you have any more detailed insights into that challenge. And again, what can we do from below, and again, this is also a challenge to Patrick, with the state failing, collapsing left, right, and center. You can steal water and declare it the liberation of the commons, but eventually that water is going to stop flowing through those taps. So this is another complexity in the South African situation. So I don't know if you have any insights, any lessons, any suggestions around, how do we deal with this?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Of course, I suppose I was just in the book I try really to move away. I suppose I don't really engage with that because I do feel like there's the issue of state capacity. Of course, it's very important, but it has been used also as a justification to just perpetuate inequality. So I didn't want to go into that, but also very practically, it was fascinating for me to find out that in such a place like Modimolle, at the time I was doing research, there was a very, very efficient the manager of technical services who had studied in the Netherlands, Delft, the Water Institute in Delft, and he was absolutely brilliant and capable of doing his job. But then, of course, he left because the situation was not probably, I suppose, it was also a bit frustrated with the job and everything. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure I have very, very concrete answers to that question, sorry. Except to say, yeah, how you do that, and especially how are you try to mobilize for that purpose beyond and outside protest, and I don't know if citizen science is indeed like a way to make citizens part of the conversation and a more direct and open confrontation with municipalities, and also try to denounce indeed if there are incompetences. I don't know. Sorry, it's a terrible answer.
Thanks, Michela. And yeah, we have Patrick just adding to this topic. You're exactly right, Vishwas. We are so overdue for a national civic movement of some sort that can put pressure on Treasury to finance a Build Back Better that puts water and sanitation as a central infrastructure push. Do we have any more comments or hands? Otherwise, I'm going to hand it.
Maybe just to, because Patrick was asking about more recent work in the Karoo, and just in relation to that, what I'm also worried about in that regard is that we are actually devolving these functions to the private sector, right? Not really in the way of the privatizations of the past years, but what we are being seeing in the Karoo is that these new companies, extractive companies, or like also the companies that work with renewable energy production, as part of the corporate social responsibility, just taking the place or replacing municipalities in providing public goods to the local population, which is of course a very serious problem, because it means you don't really deal with the problems with the municipality to start with, because you just you look at the private sector as a provider, but then also it means it's just going to work maybe for the time they're going to be there. So it's not really sustainable in the long term.
Thanks for that, Michela. So it seems like there aren't any more questions or hands. And so, yeah, Michela, I'm not sure if you have any final comments before we hand over to Vish to close.
No, thank you.
Sure. Okay. Vish, over to you to close this seminar.
Well, a very, very big thank you to Michela for making the time and for her powerful research, insights, and perspective on the water issues and how that intersects with race, class, gender, and in particular locales. And I think there's so much we can learn from this. And you could see it in the way the kind of flow of discussion happened here and some of the debate. I also want to say that there are some crucial takeaways from what you've shared with us. I mean, this issue of revisiting the Water Act, I think, is very, very important for our campaigning work. And I think there are lots of ideas you've thrown in our way around that. The water user idea, the issue of rights and ownership. I think all of these things are now definitely within the sort of purview of what we're going to be doing. I do think other ideas have also come out through your engagements. The issue of monitoring boreholes and registering them and keeping track of that. Another very important idea. I think the point about complex hydrological conditions in South Africa, differentiated in the context of climate change, is very, very important for us. And again, this is one of the optics or lenses we bring to this challenge, Patrick and others. Recognizing that Day Zero wasn't just a Cape Town event. Day Zero has happened in many, many small towns across this country during the drought. And that for us is a very, very powerful lesson. The next drought is going to be worse than the one we've had. And we are a water scarce country in some respects. And we have the complexity of water ownership and control and so on. So we really have to figure this out. And so this is where we're coming from in terms of our activism as well. We know that the next climate extreme is going to be catastrophic. So how do we deal with that? this has to be on our agenda as climate justice activists. We can't just, expect some kind of militancy to solve this problem. It's not. So we're going to have to grapple with the water challenge from all these dimensions. And this platform today, this input today, has really made an important contribution to how we're thinking about this. So thank you once again. Thank you to all the attendees. And just to remind you that we are taking on more new investment in oil, coal, and gas in South Africa. I think Jane mentioned this. So please sign our petition, share it. Michela, please share it in Italy and in other networks that you have. This is an internationalist platform. We want to isolate the carbon pariah South African regime, and it can't have its cake and eat it. And we know, and Patrick's helped us also appreciate this, that Eskom wants to use this money for more gas infrastructure investments. We know others want to use the money coming from outside for our just transition for electric vehicles, which will benefit elites and so on. So we really need to put the squeeze on the government. So please rally comrades, let's get this petition out there. We'll be sending a delegation of young people to meet the UN IPCC Secretariat in Egypt and to hand over this petition to place conditionalities on the finance to South Africa. And the conditionality is no more fracking, no more offshore oil extraction, no more new investments in coal. So that's kind of where we're coming from. For those who are also in the Joburg area, we'll be having a week of agroecology gardening at Wits University. You're all invited. It's going to be a very exciting week with John and Zira. We're expanding the Wits Food Sovereignty Hub to a second space with an indigenous garden, a fruit forest, a seed bank, etc. The training is for free, like we've always done it. So the idea is you come with your enthusiasm and go back and set up your backyard, your pavement garden, your community garden. So hopefully we'll see some of you in person next week. Otherwise, please take care, everybody, and we'll keep you posted on forthcoming events on this platform. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye, Michela.
Bye, Vish.